Welcome to the show, guys. Got Jimmy Maverick on with me. We've got an exciting show. We're going to be talking about something that is one of the most important things we could talk about ever in fantasy football is consistent fantasy players. That's what we all want. We want consistent fantasy football production. That is the C in the cuddy, consistency. And we're going to be talking about it here, going through every position and talking about the most consistent players, starting with quarterback, but also going through some not so consistent players. And Jim's going to explain what makes a player consistent in a little more details, because we have an app Jim came up with. It's a 16 round plus, which we'll link here below. And you get that alongside with the 16 round draft association. That's going to tell you all the details about every player, including their consistency score. So Jim, welcome to the show. We're talking consistency. Let's dive in. Can you explain a little bit on consistency and what makes a player consistent?
Well, sure. I mean, I think we can all agree, everybody here that's watching this show, that the absolute worst kind of fantasy player is the guy that gets 10 targets one week, 2 targets the next week, and then 10 targets again the next week. I hate those players. They are the worst because you never know when you can start them. You can't trust the player, and they can brutalize your fantasy team because they could just come through with a no-show one week, and that's it. You are screwed because you happen to put him in one of your starting positions. So I created in the app, we score every player according to the Cuddy system. C in Cuddy stands for consistency. And so our consistency rating is measuring how much their usage varies on a week-to-week basis during the prior season. So if a player is getting, 8, 10, 9, 11, 5, like if they're just riding very consistent week to week, they're going to score very high on this because there's not much variance in their usage from a week to week basis. Whereas that player that goes 10, 2, 10 is going to get brutalized on that score because, again, there's so much variance from the mean, from their average that, again, can you trust the player? That's what consistency is all about.
All right. I mean, with quarterbacks, I find, and you correct me if I'm wrong here based on your scoring system here, Jim, with quarterbacks, I find they tend to be a little more consistent. You kind of, what you see is more what you get. You kind of don't have as much volatility. Whereas if you have wide receivers, maybe one game, a certain wide receiver gets more volume than the other game, unless they're like a Travis Kelce, who's a tight end, but also a receiver, who always gets the volume, right? Or like Cooper Kupp when he was healthy, right? So start off with quarterbacks, but don't you agree that quarterbacks are relatively more consistent?
Well, one of the things that the app does is it only measures the consistency against other players of the same type. So when you're looking at the quarterback consistency ratings, it's a lot smaller pool than the running back and the wide receiver rankings, where it's like 60 to 80 players in each of those groups. With the quarterbacks, there's only maybe 20 quarterbacks that will be drafted in most drafts in fantasy football. So it's a much smaller pool. So the volatility really shows up there. And what I found very interesting is that these rushing quarterbacks, which are fantastic for fantasy, awesome. They have a huge high ceiling every week. I love them. But guess what? They're not as consistent as the pocket passers, just in their usage. And that's what we're measuring. We're measuring their usage because it could be up and down all week. I was actually looking at Josh Allen, and last year his carries each week ranged anywhere from 1 carry to 12 carries. That was his highest. And his pass attempts ranged from 25 at the lowest to 63 at the highest. That was his highest attempts in a single game. So he doesn't score well on the consistency rating because of that. But still, I think we can all agree that someone like Josh Allen has an incredibly high ceiling for fantasy and is a very valuable player. So inputs don't necessarily measure outputs, but if a guy's getting more consistent usage, you can count on him being able to be productive on a week-to-week basis.
So let's go over some quarterbacks that are consistent. I would say, again, just looking at the fantasy numbers last year, you got to say Pat Mahomes is probably the most consistent quarterback. And again, is that just reflective based on the fantasy points total?
Well, again, it's measuring their usage, like how many pass attempts, how many rush attempts, how many targets, if they're a wide receiver. So it's their opportunities. How many opportunities do they have with the ball? And yes, you're absolutely correct. Patrick Mahomes rates as one of the very best, scores a 9 out of 10 on the consistency rating. Absolutely. He is fantastic. He's such a fantastic player. And I always say that for fantasy football this season, I'm going to get myself a running quarterback or I'm going to get myself Patrick Mahomes because he's just as good. He offers just as high a ceiling as those rushing quarterbacks.
Okay, I don't want to pay a Pat Mahomes early draft capital. Can you give me a consistent quarterback that I can get a little bit later on? How's Trevor Lawrence looking?
Trevor Lawrence scored a 6 out of 10, which is above average. That's pretty good. But again, I think there was some growing pains there last year. He really did come on in the second half, very much developing very, very nicely as a quarterback. Obviously, his rookie year was just a lost cause for all intents and purposes. But still not a bad consistency score. If they're over 5, that's for me, that's good enough. I'm happy with that. So,
okay, so give us a value quarterback based on the consistency score algorithm that is, again, a value quarterback that's got a relatively high consistency score.
well, I got to say, man, I know he wasn't great last year, but Deshaun Watson was very consistent in his opportunities last year with the ball. He scored a 10 out of 10 on the consistency rating. So I think I think that portends well for the upcoming season. I do like his upside because he always was like a top 3 quarterback before the 2020 season. So, can he get back to that? I'm not sure if he can, but I do like the fact that he has a very nice, consistent amount of usage. Who is someone else that scored very well? How about Jared? Jared Goff scored an 8 out of 10 on the consistency rating.
Wow.
But yeah, I mean, I think with quarterbacks, it's a little bit more volatile than you'll see in the other positions, just because it's such a small pool of players. But again, we're measuring not their production; we're measuring their usage. So
So again, this is just one metric, guys. So just because they have a low
exactly,
consistency score doesn't mean you don't draft them. So this is just metrics here. We're talking analytics. We're talking specifically on their consistency here and doing some deep diving. Again, people like to get critical with their fantasy analysis. This is the deep dive analytical stuff that's on the higher end, and other than just like, hey, my gut feeling says that guy. So we're diving deep here. All right. So
okay.
any other ones you want to mention here that got a really good high consistency score before we move on to running backs?
Why don't we move on to running backs right now? So, because I think, again, because it's a larger pool of players, I think you're getting better consistency ratings. And it's important to note that, yes, this is only 20% of the Cuddy score, right? And the reason why it's only 20% is because you can have a low volume, consistent player, right? You can have a guy that gets 6, 5, 7, it just moving along at a very low production rate. He'll get a nice consistency rating, but what he's going to have trouble with is with the upside. He's not going to have good upside score. He's not going to have good value, that sort of thing.
Maybe he's not durable. Maybe he's not durable. That's why cutting is so important. Consistency, upside, durability, depth, and youth all factor in. So some guy could be ultra consistent, but he gets hurt every single week. So
exactly.
might not want to draft them. So that's where we get into it. So
yes, exactly. And then the opposite is the super reliable, inconsistent player where he's going to play, you just don't know what he's going to do.
We're diving deep today. All right, let's talk about some consistent running backs here. Obviously, based on last year, not a fan, but I got to talk about it. I'm guessing Austin Eckler was Mr. Consistent last year.
He actually was. Yes, he has scored very well on the consistency rating. And I think last year was because all of his wide receivers were injured. There was no one else to throw the ball to for a big chunk of the season. So I think that that definitely helped. But again, the dude's 28. He's aging. The whole offense is aging. It's an old offense. 31-year-old Keenan Allen, 29-year-old Mike Evans, and 28-year-old Austin Eckler. That's not great.
They don't want to pay him. This is why I think they're looking at a Jahmyr Gibbs, right? A Jahmyr Gibbs is a plug and play that they can replace Eckler with, or maybe a Bijan Robinson or someone like that. I think they really want to replace him. But again, I go back to the perfect explanation. Zeke Elliott, right? He's on the way out. He's in his sunset years at 28. He was already paid as advice. He came into the league as a workhorse, a true amazing player, whereas Eckler came in as an undrafted free agent backup to Melvin Gordon for 2 years. Now he's 28. I'm not going to pay this guy a big mega contract where I can get a young, hungry, fresh 21-year-old that's more dynamic. I don't got to pay nothing. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't make sense. Eckler is at the end of the rope, in my opinion. And is that going to be enough to piss him off to say, hey, these guys are going to pay me? Like, am I going to keep performing and breaking my back here for these guys for someone who doesn't believe in me? It's something interesting to watch this year. And that's why I think it's going to be the decline of Eckler. But I could be wrong. Maybe he comes and plays with a chip on his shoulder. We don't know.
Yeah, and the Chargers have tried to bring in a second running back in that backfield and just have failed miserably at that whole prospect. So we'll see if they want to go ahead and spend a high draft capital to bring someone in. Personally, I do think that the Cowboys are going to draft, I don't know if they'll maybe go Bijan, but I think that they may go Charbonnet or someone like that, bring them into the backfield to replace, because they need a hammer back there. That's Tony Pollard is not a hammer. He's a finesse guy, so I'd be excited about that if they did spend some high draft capital to bring in another star running back to that backfield. Yeah. So,
all right. So other guys that are consistent here.
Well, I got to say, man, Kenneth Walker scored a 9 out of 10. Nick Chubb scored a 10 out of 10. Let's see here. Who else? Breece Hall, when Breece Hall was playing, man, 10 out of 10 consistency. He was getting great volume, and he was a integral part of that offense while he was healthy. So that really makes me feel better about him coming back from injury, is to know that his usage will be, he'll be a centerpiece. He'll be a centerpiece of that team. Let's see here. Anyone else jumping off the page? Dameon Pierce, 10 out of 10, baby. 10 out of 10 on the consistency score. And
youth is on his side, upside's on his side. Again, as of right now, as long as they don't draft anybody else, I think Dameon's the guy.
There's so many holes in that Houston offense that they got to upgrade. They got to upgrade that offensive line. They got to bring in some receivers. They have no receivers, man. They got nobody. So I think Dameon Pierce, if they don't take, maybe they take a guy on day 3. If they take a running back on day 3, that'll be fine. I'm not going to worry about it. But I don't think they're going to spend any of their high draft capital picks on a running back.
No,
I don't think they need to. They're in a really good situation. Let's see here. Who else? Tyler Algier. 10 out of 10, baby. Yeah. Wow. So another very good high consistency player. So I like that.
People are asking again, what's the metric? What is making Algier so consistent? Can you explain that?
Well, again, like I said, we look at his usage. How many opportunities did he have at the ball? How many carries? How many targets? And you find out what the median is. What is the median amount of opportunities he had with the ball on average? And then we measure the variance, how far each week is deviating from that average. And the more it deviates, the lower the score. So that's what we're looking at here, basically. So we know that Atlanta will run the ball. We know that's their MO. So I'm feeling pretty good about him, unless they bring in another high draft pick running back. But I don't think they're going to do it. I think Algier's a pretty good solution for that backfield right now. They got other things they need to fix.
I think so as well. All right, moving on to wide receiver. Or do you want to cover anything else running back?
Well, let's see here. As far as running backs that did not score well on the consistency rating last year, Travis Etienne only scored a 3 out of 10. Wow. And Cam Akers only scored a 4 out of 10. That's not surprising because we saw how little his usage was at the beginning of the season. And then at the end of the season, he was getting like 20 carries a game right at the end of the season. So I'm not surprised that he scored there. But it'd be nice to see Travis Etienne improve this year. Obviously, both these guys coming back from injury, I think that's a big part of why their usage was so volatile last year. So
yeah, you don't want any volatility. You need consistency, and those guys are definitely volatile.
Yeah. So wide receivers.
Who is consistent? I'm going to say right off the bat, Jefferson jumps out at me as a guy that's super consistent, I would say.
Well, he's a high volume player, but actually his consistency rating, he only scored a 6 out of 10. Wow, so
why is that?
Well, because again, his usage was all over the place last year, and it was high volume. But let's see here if I can. I don't have
very accurate. There was a bunch of games where he actually busted. Like look at week 3, 4.4 points. I mean, week 17, 2.5. You look at week 11, 6.3. There was a bunch of games where he just wasn't good, and then he had a bunch of boom games as well, right? So there was some volatile games for sure.
There was, yeah. Like I'm looking at his usage right now. It was 11, then 12, then 6, then 13, then 13, then 8. Here's another point where he went 16 targets one week, 5 targets the next, 11 targets the week after that. This is the kind of guy that I'm talking about with, he's not as bad as some, but still you can see there's volatility. He closed out the season final 2 weeks of the year. He only got 5 targets in each game, which is terrible because we're talking the fantasy championships there. So again, that's why he's not scoring as well as some other wide receivers. Like, for instance,
I brought him up first because naturally people think he's consistent. He's the number one fantasy producer, but in actuality, you just got to be aware that there's some volatility there.
Yeah, there is, exactly. I wouldn't say it's bad volatility. I mean, again, he scores a 6 out of 10. That's above average. That's pretty good. I'm happy with that. So, I'm comfortable with taking a player like that, but there are better options. For instance, Jamar Chase, the other big guy that everybody's talking about, his consistency was 9 out of 10. So, again, on a week-to-week basis, his usage was better than Justin Jefferson, just in knowing what he's going to get. And he obviously gets a very high volume. So that's
why you have 5 elements of this, because again, Jamar Chase, yes, more consistent, but not as durable. He played 12 games. Jefferson played more. So there's so many factors in this that make up that optimal player.
Exactly. And so as the better they score cutty points. And then those cutty points are added up to give them their cutty score. So if you have poor durability, but really good consistency, they're going to kind of almost cancel each other out. Whereas if you have high durability, high consistency, boom, you get shot up the charts because you get points on both. You earn cutty points on both. So that's what you want.
All right.
Go ahead. So let's see here. Some
other players you want to mention here? Other wide receivers?
Yeah, sure. So again, some rookies, excellent consistency ratings. Both Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave scored a 10 out of 10. That's fantastic. Love that for the upside for this upcoming year. You've got guys like, let's see here, Chris Godwin scored a 9 out of 10, which is great. His usage was actually really good coming back from injury. Someone like Christian Watson. We've talked about Christian Watson. I've got him labeled as a bust player this year, but Christian Watson only scored a 5 out of 10. And that's not surprising. I think it also because he was coming back from injury. I think that's a big part of that as well, because he was used very sparingly for the first half of the season. Let's see here. Some other high consistency players. Let's see here. Deontay Johnson scored a 9 out of 10 on consistency. And he did. He got 147 targets. He was getting used. He just couldn't do anything with it because he had a terrible quarterback. We'll see if his quarterback can be better this year. I think he's going to bounce back. I think he's going to be fine.
Pickett just said he wants to be one of the best there is. Like, he came out and made a whole bold statement. So we look for him to kind of step it up.
Yeah, George Pickens got a 10 out of 10. So very consistent receiver usage when it comes to the Pittsburgh Steelers. We just need a better quarterback. We're hoping that second-year step up can happen for the quarterback to help these guys do better, to help them perform better. Let's see here. How about, here's a perfect example of a very consistent low-volume player, Gabe Davis. Okay. Gabe Davis, his usage fluctuated between about 4 and 6 targets per game. It was terrible for fantasy, but he was consistent. He was getting about the same amount of usage every week, just very low, and he was overdrafted anyway. So that's you shouldn't have taken him there. Here's an interesting one: Juju Smith-Schuster. His usage 2 out of 10, very very poor, very much all over the place. Not surprising looking at the Kansas City Chiefs. How do you feel about him now that he is basically the wide receiver 1 in New England?
I still don't like Juju. I'm not a fan. I just don't. He's not a true wide receiver 1. Never was.
But he is probably going to be the wide receiver 1 for the Patriots this year. I mean,
Patriots always have like 1Bs, 2As as their wide receiver 1s. It's never like a true 1. I hate that team. I hate that team for fantasy. I never touch them.
He's terrible. Yes. Bill Belichick hates your fantasy team, man. That's a rule.
Yeah.
So some of the players, some of the wide receivers that scored very poorly on consistency ratings include players like Stephon Diggs, which if you had him as a player last year, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The dude completely disappeared during the fantasy playoffs. It was excruciating. He got like 10 targets over the final 3 weeks of the season. Amari Cooper, who is a perennial low consistency player. Now last year, he was such a bargain on the draft board because he was going like 8th round. He was worth it because you were playing him as a flex. But now he's like going to be like a 4th round player this year. And I'm not sure I can trust that.
Let me mention something about Amari Cooper. 4.7
Sure.
points. Imagine you draft Amari Cooper. He wasn't cheap last year to get him on your team. He wasn't like around 1 or 2 or 3, but he wasn't cheap. People drafted him assuming he'd be a stud or decent anyway. 4.7 points week 1. Imagine going into your first week and you have Amari Cooper as your wide receiver 2 and you get 4.7 points. Then he has a couple good weeks. Week 4, 1.9 points. This is PPR, guys. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, again, look at his usage. It was like 12 targets, 4 targets, and then he bounced back up, and that's what Amari Cooper has done his entire career. He has always been that player, very inconsistent. But last year, again, I was getting him in the 8th round in tons of drafts, and he was actually a great player because he ended up like as the wide receiver 9. So he offered such value, and you got him as your 8th player off the board. He was a great choice then. But this year, as a 4th round, that consistency is just going to kill you. If he was your wide receiver 1, it's brutal. It's too brutal. Don't do it.
All right, let's wrap this up here with tight ends. Let's go. I mean, without a doubt, Kelsey is going to score a 10, I would guess.
Oh, yes. And again, the tight ends is a much smaller group. There's maybe only 20 tight ends that are taken in any given draft for the most part. So Travis Kelce is the king. He is the 10 out of 10. And I'm not sure any other player scored, even got a 10 out of 10. But we do have some players that scored well. TJ Hawkinson, very consistent last year, 8 out of 10. Love his usage. I do like his upside for the upcoming year. It is a contract year for him, by the way. Yeah. Let's see here. And Dallas Goedert got really good usage while he was healthy. I think he missed like 5 games. Mark Andrews, another one who was injury plagued, but still managed to get an 8 out of 10 on the games that he played. So he is the wide receiver 1 for that team. That's not surprising. So
I lower my expectations for consistency with tight ends. I really do. Unless you draft Kelsey early, I'd lower expectations.
Yeah. And some poor ratings for tight ends. Evan Ingram only scored a 1 out of 10 on his consistency rating last year.
I believe it.
Yeah, Dawson Knox, 3 out of 10. That's not surprising. I think most people are. And Cole Kmet, 2 out of 10. Just terrible. Yeah. Tyler Higbee, 1 out of 10. There's some.
Don't bet on Cole Kmet. How about that? Yeah.
Maybe there's some upside on that offense this year, but I mean, I'm not really looking his way. I don't think there's a whole lot that he's going to be able to do this year. So, but again, it's a much thinner pool too. There's not that many players, and it's a very low volume position, way lower than the wide receivers. So you got to take that into account as well. So.
All right, guys, there is some consistency for you. We gave you some consistent players for the full roster. Get the 16-round draft solution. I've linked it below. And then you could upgrade your order to the 16-round plus, right? Both standing alone solutions to help you guys crush your league. Remember, guys,
I'm still building the app out. It's going to be ready to go by about May 21st with all the information in it, but the consistency and durability rankings are already in the system. So you can look at those and see how your favorite players scored.
All right, guys, make sure you guys subscribe, thumbs up, and we're going to keep rolling out the content here for you as we approach the NFL draft, which is around the corner. All right, thanks, Jim. I appreciate you as always.
Thank you, Joe. Looking forward to talking about those rookies next week.
Can't wait. It's around the corner, the NFL draft, and after that, full flow fantasy football season is here.
Sounds good.
Talk to you guys. We're out.
All right.
Bye.